This is The Meaning of Green Season 6. I'm Vivian Thomson. In Season 1, my guests and I examined how we've managed to solve or not to solve major environmental problems, and we applied the policy lessons we had learned to climate change. Season 2 investigated the links between power, freedom, and the environment, and whether those links shed light on the coronavirus's emergence and spread. Season 3's overarching theme was place and the environment. Season 4 was about environmental and public health protection during challenging economic times. Season 5 asked, how do elections affect environmental and public health protection? And conversely, how do public health and environmental conditions influence elections? Season 6 is about movement and the environment. The Meaning of Green is independently produced in Cedar Closet Studios in Silver Spring, Maryland, and has no sponsor. No outside entity influences the content of this ad-free podcast. Before I started The Meaning of Green, I was for 20 years a professor of environmental policy at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. Outside of academia, I've also been an environmental regulatory official in Virginia and at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. My 3 published books are about garbage transport, climate change policy in the U.S., Brazil, and Germany, and about who wields power and how when we regulate air pollution. You can find out more about The Meaning of Green and find links for all podcast episodes at the podcast's website, meaningofgreen.com. It's March 2025, and many people in the U.S. and around the world are alarmed by what's happening with Donald Trump's second presidency. The president and his top aides, not all of them are men, but many are asserting powers they don't have under our constitutional system. This episode focuses on one especially destructive example of that brazen power play, the mass firing of public servants. Because many of the firings happened on February 14th, some people are calling it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 2025. The Trump administration has ordered the arbitrary firing of an estimated 200,000 workers across the federal government. It's reported that 75,000 workers have resigned after receiving a coercive email from Elon Musk's team. The administration is trying to dismantle entire agencies. These firings violate the rules for letting workers go. And the workers being fired are there to implement laws that are meant to protect the American people and, among other things, our wildlife. For example, ocelots, which will figure into this episode. The president and his men are, in effect, trying to undo a long list of public protections without explicit congressional assent, at least to date. Meanwhile, the U.S. House of Representatives has passed a bill that would let the Congress reverse important environmental protections adopted during President Biden's last year in office. Ironically, weakening some environmental rules could have the greatest adverse impact on people who voted for President Trump. Those details will come in the next episode. These 2 episodes are not the ones I had envisioned launching right now, and they're not really about movement and the environment, but the unjustified attacks on federal employees and the threats to public health and the environment are too earth-shaking and important to ignore. Let's start with understanding a bit about the federal civil service. The federal workforce is not all that large, relatively speaking. The non-military civilian workforce amounts to about 2.3 million people, as compared with 1.8 million in 1960. And since 1960, many new laws have been enacted, and the work of the federal government on behalf of the American people has grown enormously. State and local governments employ 10 times as many people as are in the federal civilian workforce. The vast majority of American workers, 135 million, are employed in the private sector. Sharp, steep reductions in the federal workforce in the tens or hundreds of thousands will put people out of work all around the country and will cripple agencies across the federal government. Those agencies are there because of laws written to protect people from suffering inflicted by others, to alleviate distress, to forestall disruptions, and to promote due process and open government. You might say, well, but what has the federal government ever done for me? Here are just a few examples of how federal agencies have protected Americans. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency implements the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act's air pollution reductions resulted in an estimated $2 trillion worth of health improvements in the year 2020 alone, exceeding by over 30 times the costs of those pollution reductions in the same year. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a relatively young and small agency that's been a special target of Elon Musk's, has put $21 billion back in the pockets of Americans who were defrauded by financial institutions. One official at the Food and Drug Administration, Francis Kelsey, led the charge to keep thalidomide, which caused severe birth defects, from being marketed in the United States. The U.S. Department of Justice broke up AT&T, known as Ma Bell, setting the stage for competition and innovation in the phone industry. Millions of Americans enjoy visiting our vast system of national parks every year. The Centers for Disease Control, in conjunction with private industry, came up with a COVID vaccine in record time. Millions of Americans across all walks of life have benefited from the Inflation Reduction Act's incentives for climate-friendly practices. Firing people without regard to what they're doing or how well they're performing beggars belief. While we must be supremely grateful for the many ways in which federal workers help protect us and our families, we must also recognize the need for reforms with the federal workforce. Virtually every president in the modern era has tried to institute change. One of the most conspicuous such efforts was led by President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. This initiative was buttressed by a 1994 law that authorized employee buyouts. Here's Vice President Gore on that topic in 1998 at an MIT conference.
We think by focusing on results and giving increased flexibility to managers and making other specific changes, we can bring about the kind of transformation in government organizations that many of you have brought about in your private companies. Already, we have reduced the size of the federal government by 350,000 people in the last 5 years. It is now smaller in size than it has been since 1961, the first year of President John Kennedy's administration. And it's smaller as a percentage of the workforce than it was since before the New Deal. We've eliminated 200 outdated government programs, eliminated more than 16,000 pages of red tape, saved $137 billion in the process. But we need further improvements in regulatory reform and in legal reform. We need to advance rapidly by using these new understandings and new techniques.
Under the Clinton-Gore initiative, not many of those 350,000 workers were actually laid off. Most left through attrition or they accepted buyouts. Among the well-known problems with the federal government are, it's often hard to quantify the work products of federal civil servants, unlike the work products of people in the private sector. It can be time-consuming and difficult to hire people and to fire non-performers. Sometimes government agencies fail to protect us as they're supposed to, or they waste money. Federal workers can become risk-averse and unwilling to embrace needed innovation, especially with repeated changes in direction by political appointees. These are the kinds of problems that generate headlines and attention. But when the federal government works as it's supposed to, that is not news. And the federal government doesn't advertise its successes. Largely invisible are the highly skilled federal workers who may have forgone higher salaries in the private sector because they want to serve the public. Civil servants need and have strong job protections to ensure they can't be fired for political reasons. Well, why do we even have the Federal Civil Service? Here's a clip from a 2020 video produced by Professor Drew Stevenson, a law professor in Houston, to explain the answer to that question.
In the old days, we had something called the spoils system, or sometimes referred to as the political patronage. And for the first 100 years of our country's history, basically until after the Civil War, we used the system. The phrase, the spoils system, comes from the old saying, to the victors go the spoils. It's not about spoiling things. It's about spoils in the sense of we won, so we should get to do what we want. And the idea was that whoever won the White House could replace basically any federal employee or official, let's say, with somebody that they wanted, which was usually from the same party or who had personal loyalty to the president. This had downsides, as you can imagine. The first is that there was a massive turnover in the federal government every time a new party won the White House. So the president just starts purging everyone from the federal government from the other political party and giving jobs to people who worked for the campaign, donated to the campaign, people the president owes a favor to, and so forth. And this meant that we had this massive disruption. There was no institutional memory, no consistency or experience. And this is what would happen, is that we would have kind of chaos every time a new party took over the White House, because so many people would just cycle out and then new people cycle back in. This, by the way, can have a ripple effect on the economy. Imagine you're part of a regulated industry like the railroads or the banks. And every time a new party wins the White House, nobody in the agency that is your oversight or regulation has any idea what they're doing or remembers how the agreements or rules from last year, or they don't know the people in the industry and so forth. Also, keep in mind that the appointees were based on either personal loyalty or campaign donations and contributions. And this had the unfortunate effect that we had a lot of people running the federal government for the first 100 years of our history who lacked experience, were completely inexperienced and incompetent. Sometimes they were illiterate. Sometimes they had no idea what their agency even did or anything about it. And they would find themselves with this rewarded for their campaign work with this cushy government job that they had no idea how to do. So we had completely incompetent people in a lot of these positions, or people that were completely unmotivated, who didn't show up to work or had no reason to get anything done because they weren't given the job because anybody thought they would be good at it. They were given the job because somebody owed them a political favor. The spoils system or patronage system incentivizes bribery and government corruption. So people would bribe their way into these positions. And then once they were there, they would demand bribes from everybody who wanted them to issue a permit or approve an application or renew a license or things like that. Whatever their agency's job was, they would demand bribes.
Professor Stevenson then talks about civil service reforms that began with the Pendleton Act of 1883.
And then we, in the 20th century, started to expand and revise this. The Pendleton Act initially applied to very few federal positions, and now it applies to most of the people the Civil Service Reform Act that work for the federal government. So first, the civil service employees have some job security against political firing. So if you work for OSHA or the Environmental Protection Agency or Federal Trade Commission, you don't have to worry that just because somebody from the other political party has won the White House in an election that you're going to get fired. And you can stay at your job. By the way, there's an idea here that the job security also ends up being a perk, so you can attract more talented people to work for the government, because there's a lot of people who value job security in the same way that other people might value a higher salary. Also, hirings and promotions are based on either experience or seniority and credentials and job performance. Also, we're going to have firing only for good cause. In other words, we can't just fire you because you look like a liberal or you act kind of conservative. We need to show that you did something wrong. You are showing up late for work every day. You missed deadlines. You punched your supervisor in the face. Something like that is actually a grounds for termination of some sort of malfeasance or neglect. Otherwise, you're going to have your job. So it's not absolute job security. You have to do your work, right? But it's supposed to be protection against political firings.
Above and beyond the employment protections that the Trump administration is simply ignoring, there's a fundamental constitutional principle at play here, too. Under our Constitution, the president is supposed to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote. When the president is sworn into office, he promises to faithfully execute the office of the president and to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Under our Constitution, the president cannot obliterate government functions that Congress has authorized and funded by law. Under our Constitution, only Congress has the so-called power of the purse, which means the power to control and direct government spending. There's already a long list of lawsuits challenging the Trump administration's actions. That the Congress and not the president has the power of the purse is central to our separation of powers. Here's Jeffrey Rosen of the National Constitution Center on the idea of separation of powers. This clip is from a video posted in 2022.
Today we're going to talk about the separation of powers. If that sounds dry, let's remember that the founding generation thought that the separation of powers was the single most important part of the Constitution because it prevents the president from becoming a king or a tyrant. So let's start with some definitions. Separation of powers refers to the fact the Constitution distributes power among the three branches of government. There's a legislative branch, Congress, an executive branch, the president, and a judicial branch headed by the Supreme Court. But the ultimate power resides in we, the people. The Constitution also sets up a system of checks and balances. It grants each branch of government the power to check abuses or excesses by the other branches. And it further divides power through the system of federalism, which sets out distinct and limited spheres of authority for the national government and the states. Separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Why did the founding generation believe that this complicated system, which divides power between and among the national government and the states, was the most important part of the Constitution? Because in their view, the Constitution, founded on separation of powers, was the only way to protect the unalienable rights promised in the Declaration of Independence, the only way to ensure that the president couldn't become a tyrant or king. In other words, unlike the King of England or the president of Russia, the president in America doesn't hold all the power. We live under a government of laws, not of one man, because power is separated between and among the president, Congress, and independent judges, and divided between the federal government and the states.
The framers of the U.S. Constitution thought that human nature itself made government necessary. On that point, Mr. Rosen quotes James Madison, one of the architects of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
And then Madison tells us what he means by government being a reflection on human nature. These are wonderful Madison words again. He says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But as Madison and his other framers knew, men are not angels, but they're also capable of some virtue, of some self-restraint. We're neither angels nor devils. That's why Madison says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, to oblige it to control itself. So now we see why the separation of powers is so urgently important and really so interesting as well. The framers came up with a system in which the branches are meant to compete with each other to ensure that no single branch becomes too powerful. Madison, who of course was a primary drafter of both the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, thought that the separation of powers is more important for protecting liberty even than a Bill of Rights, and even more important than a written Constitution itself. After all, lots of countries today have Bill of Rights and written constitutions, including Russia. Russia has a constitution, and the Russian Constitution has many inspiring words. But the words of the Russian Constitution are empty words, and its soaring promises are a lie. Because in Russia, the president is a tyrant who holds all the power. In Russia, there is no separation of powers. George Washington recognized the danger that America would go down the same path of nearly every government in history, where a president or a general, under the guise of being supported by the people, had ended up seizing all the power and becoming a tyrant. At Newburgh in 1783, when Washington's soldiers threatened a mutiny because they hadn't been paid, Washington appealed to their virtue and assured them of his own in emphasizing that he would never seize all the power. And for millions of people today who are fighting for freedom across America and around the world, the way to protect rather than to overturn the liberties of our country is the separation of powers, which ensures a government of laws and not of men.
How are President Trump and his appointees testing the boundaries of our Constitution? In February, the Wall Street Journal published a pithy video response to that question. Here are some clips from that piece, which is by Madeline Marshall and Caitlin Wang, and focuses on USAID, the Agency for International Development. Chiming in at the end of this clip are UC Berkeley Law Professor Erwin Chemerinsky and Richard Painter, who worked as the chief ethics officer for President George W. Bush. DOGE refers to the so-called Department of Government Efficiency headed by Elon Musk.
It all starts in Congress. They draft legislation that directs what the agency should do and how much money they should get for it. For example, here's the law introduced by then-Senator Marco Rubio. It gives direction to USAID to provide education for displaced children and build those institutions in coordination with private and civil society organizations. The employees of USAID then take that direction and budget from Congress and do the work of actually making it happen. But like all federal agencies, it's managed by the executive branch. So the president oversees these employees and how they spend the money through the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. The president also oversees the U.S. Treasury, which handles the distribution of congressionally mandated money. In his first 3 weeks, Trump has tried to essentially take over these parts of the system from Congress. He ordered the money for federal programs be stopped. He let Elon Musk's DOGE access sensitive payment systems. And with USAID, he's ordered it to be moved under the State Department, led by Secretary Marco Rubio. The main check is really the responsibility of the federal courts after there's been a challenge to the law. There are dozens of lawsuits already filed, and in some cases, the courts already ordered injunctions against the administration. Legal experts say a lot can be stopped or reversed through the legal system. But that's a slow process, and what it would take to undo the damage at USAID is uncertain. This entire system of checks and balances also assumes the president will follow the court's orders. If Trump decided to ignore a court order, experts agree that's when it would become a
constitutional crisis of a sort we've never seen before.
A March 5th U.S. Supreme Court decision could force the administration to unfreeze nearly $2 billion in grants awarded by USAID. The president does not get to decide which laws to implement and which ones to ignore. That being said, many laws have ambiguous provisions, and presidents can and do take advantage of that ambiguity. However, even though the president is the head of the executive branch, he is not the sole boss of federal workers. Rather, those workers have 3 bosses. They must follow what Congress tells them to do in the nation's laws. They are subject to the leadership of political appointees in the White House, and they must abide by court decisions. Many laws also require federal employees to work closely with the states, as state governments are often involved with implementing national laws like the Clean Air Act. Congress does not step out of the way after passing laws. Congress often sponsors oversight hearings to grill agency leaders on what they're doing. When I was at EPA during the Reagan administration, we would often receive what were called dinglegrams. Those were incredibly long, detailed sets of questions from Democratic Representative John Dingell of Michigan. EPA staff would have to answer all of those questions. We couldn't just pretend the letter got lost in the mail. Imagine that you have 3 supervisors who might be telling you to do 3 somewhat different things. And imagine that you must also make your work transparent to the public, especially interest groups and businesses, and give them the right to comment on what you are doing. Under federal law, agencies must follow long-established, elaborate procedures for adopting regulations. So parties outside the agency have plenty of time to comment and, if they wish, sue the agency in court. Given all of those competing and often conflicting pressures, you might not work very efficiently or fast. In the end, civil servants must answer to Congress, the White House, interest groups, and the courts in serving the public good. An underappreciated and vital function of civil servants is to oversee and monitor federal contractors like Elon Musk. Commenting on that subject is Professor Don Kettle of the University of Maryland in a clip from a Washington Monthly video posted in February 2025.
One important factoid is that we spend more money on contractors outside the government than we spend on the payroll and benefits for federal employees. How much bigger, how much huger? And the answer is we don't exactly know. As best we can tell, there may be something like 5 times as many contractors out there doing work for the federal government as there are government employees. But one of the things we do know is that the contracts are everywhere. And it turns out that, for example, Elon Musk, as you pointed out, has a major contract from NASA for SpaceX to engage in commercial space flight. Of course, he wants to be able to operate as free as possible from federal regulations, but 2 points so worth pointing out there in terms of just the the complexity of managing these contractor systems. On one launch, his launch pad literally blew up. The launch of the rocket was successful, but the concrete pad underneath it was blown to smithereens because of the sheer power of the rocket. It's an incredibly powerful device that we've never seen before. And it just blew the pieces of the pad everywhere, including big chunks that flew into a nature preserve.
This is not just any nature preserve. I'll come back to that in a minute.
And so to be able to conduct subsequent launches, Musk had to promise that he would create a pad that was stronger and wouldn't endanger the environment, which he sort of thought was ridiculous. So the question is, what kind of regulation should we have over our contractors to ensure that they deliver high quality goods at good prices and that produce the results that they want and don't do other things that we don't want them to do? Like, for example, second part of the story, I launched a few weeks ago where the rocket took off and the spacecraft blew up. And it blew up over the Caribbean, Florida and the Caribbean, to the point that it was raining debris down. And so the FAA had to clear the airspace out from underneath it so that airplanes flying in the neighborhood didn't get hit by the debris from the spacecraft that had exploded. So that's sort of a bad idea. You don't want to have a spacecraft that blow up and endanger international air travel. And so now there's a question of what kind of regulations are appropriate and important for ensuring the safety of everybody else for the launch of contracted out commercial space vehicles.
The nature preserve next to the SpaceX launching area is called Boca Chica, which is 1/4 the size of the District of Columbia, but hosts an estimated 300 bird species. In this Defenders of Wildlife video posted in 2024, we learn about Boca Chica from Gage Davila, a reporter with Texas Public Radio, Dr. Sharon Wilcox with Defenders of Wildlife, and Dr. Christopher Balsaldu. Gage Davila starts with a vivid description of the size of some of the concrete pieces that have flown from the SpaceX launch site.
Like some pieces were the size of minivans going into the Gulf.
Boca Chica is a special place. It is one of the most unique, ecologically diverse places in North America. It is a hemispheric meeting place where millions of migratory birds move through every year, and 10 threatened or endangered species call this place home, including the oplomado falcon, the ocelot, and 5 species of sea turtle. People are always surprised to learn that ocelots call the state of Texas home, but only 60 or 80 remain, and they are critically endangered.
So we're at Boca Chica Beach. This has always been known as like the working class beach, Brownsville's beach. At one time, this area was an untouched coastline, and that's very quickly changing. You're no longer on a beach anymore. You're now in a factory, for lack of a better word.
SpaceX's experimental launch site is surrounded by National Wildlife Refuge, state parks, tidal flats, and public beaches. And they are launching some of the most powerful rockets to ever leave the planet. Already, they've had significant impacts on the fragile lands around this launch pad as they have started wildfires and cast debris far and wide into these lands.
My name is Christopher Basaldu. I live here in Brownsville. I grew up here in Brownsville and in Corpus Christi, Texas. I am Eshtokna and a member of the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe. This area is considered to be very sacred. This is our ancestral site, and Boca Chica Beach, the mouth of Boca Chica, literally the little mouth of the Rio Grande, of this big river. This is a creation site of our people, and SpaceX is desecrating it. SpaceX is treating this area as its own dumping and experimental ground.
Activities like what SpaceX is doing at this site are only working to exacerbate environmental damage, destroying the Earth on our way to Mars.
A few minutes of space travel produces as much carbon pollution as, and perhaps far more than, each individual from the bottom billion polluters produces in their entire lifetime. The damage from firing thousands of civil servants or coercing them to resign includes losing a huge amount of expertise and institutional knowledge, including that of the federal employees who oversee endangered species programs for animals like the ocelot. Political appointees don't necessarily bring any relevant background to their positions. When I was at EPA, one political appointee was amiable enough, but was deeply ignorant of relevant law and policy. The individual even seemed to zone out during meetings, inspiring an EPA staff member to write a gently mocking song based on the Everly Brothers' Wake Up, Little Susie. Let's go back to some of the words by James Madison that were quoted by Mr. Rosen at the Constitution Center. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. James Madison also said about our government that, quote, ambition must be made to counter ambition, end quote. I remember rereading those words when I took a class with Professor Martha Durthik, who would become my PhD advisor and a longtime mentor. I've mentioned Professor Durthik in previous episodes. She was one of the most well-regarded political scientists of her time, and she published something like 12 books that covered many different topics. She was a conservative Republican, but that tendency did not bias her analyses or writings. I've wondered what Professor Durthik would say about the Trump administration's assertions of power. She died in 2015, so I can't ask her, but a talk she gave in 2011 provides some hints. In this talk, she laid into the No Child Left Behind Act, which was adopted by a Republican Congress, along with Republican President George W. Bush. In the lead-in to this particular excerpt, she criticized Congress for not amending the law after it had punished teachers and school systems all over the country for not meeting federally set standards. This clip is from a video posted by Hillsdale College.
Idealism and wishful thinking, of course, are part of the explanation. But a deeper part of the explanation lies in long-term changes in Congress as an institution. Madison thought that in a republic, the legislature would always predominate. It would be the more energetic, even overbearing branch. But this view failed to anticipate the emergence over time of the populist presidency, who is in our TV sets every day, and who is the agenda setter in national policymaking and the sponsor of policy proposals that often emerge in grandiose form, as No Child Left Behind did, from the cauldron of presidential election contests.
In the next episode, which is called Let Them Drink Lead, I'll give you more of Professor Durthik's incisive, blunt speech because it connects directly with the current crisis in our national government. I'll also shed light on who stands to lose the most from presidential and congressional threats to roll back health and environmental standards. I'm Vivian Thomson. Thank you for listening to The Meaning of Green, Season 6.